Today I think I'll make a video about Wilhelmius Van Diper's systematic theology. Hey, who's this? It's John the Independent Fundamental Baptist 2, tamed by a Baptist. You know what? I'll make a video about something on which I agree with the Independent Fundamental Baptists. Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where we build churches in Minecraft while talking about Christianity, and today I'm going to be talking about something that's not sensitive or controversial at all. I'm talking about mental health. But first, John the Independent Fundamental Baptist has returned, so for those of you who don't know about him, about his lore, I found a parrot early on when I started this segment of the series. I tamed him, called him the Presbyterian Parrot, asked you guys in the comments what I should name him. You guys decided on John the Independent Fundamental Baptist, and I named him that, but the second I did, he was killed by a creeper explosion, and everyone thought it was my fault. Everyone thought I did it because he converted to being Baptist. Guys, I didn't do it. He died of creeper causes, natural causes. But now his son is here, John the Independent Fundamental Baptist 2, tamed by a Baptist, it seems. And, it looks like because it was tamed by a Baptist, I don't own him. Oh, wait, no, I'm not trying to drown him, I promise. Because it was tamed by a Baptist, it means I don't own him. So I guess the Baptists sent this bird to spy on me. But because I'm thankful to the Baptists for bringing back my old parrot, or his son at least, because of that, I'm going to say one thing I agree with Independent Fundamental Baptists on. Normally, I'm very critical of Baptists and their theology, and the Independent Fundamental Baptists, the IFBs, are seen as the most hardcore extremist Baptists, and they're wrong about a lot of things. But one thing I think they have a good approach to is mental health. And I think it's important to talk about this because there's a lot of stigma about mental health in the church. A lot of Christians really aren't open to having conversations about mental health because a lot of them are skeptical of mental health. So the reason it's hard to talk about this is because so many people think that if you talk about mental health concerns, you're not trusting Jesus enough. And I'm one of those people. I'm one of the bad guys in the story. No, I'm kidding. No, I'm not exactly kidding. I do think that some people go too far. Like recently, John MacArthur, a very conservative Baptist, made it sound like no mental illnesses are real at all. Like PTSD is fake. I'm not saying none of it is real. But I think the approach to mental health that our culture has is fundamentally wrong and fundamentally sinful. And I think there is suspicion about mental health in the church for darn good reason. And this is something the Baptists are right about. I'm like very Presbyterian when it comes to most issues like science. I'm an evolutionist. I think Christians need to focus and believe in science. But when it comes to when it comes to mental health, I'm an Independent Fundamental Baptist. That's what I am. I think the different Christian approaches to mental health come down to the question of whether self-love is a good thing. And I think there's two approaches. There's the Catholic approach, which says self-love is good, and the Puritan approach, which says self-love is bad. There are these two approaches. Like, obviously the Catholics wouldn't say all self-love is good. They would say self-love is something that could be abused and turned into selfishness. The Catholics generally follow the thinking of Thomas Aquinas, who says that, technically self-love in and of itself is a good thing. It just gets abused, it gets misused. But there's nothing inherently wrong with self-love in and of itself. Whereas the Puritans, like Jonathan Edwards, said the self-love is the root of all sin. And even as early as the Westminster Confession, it says self-love is bad. And I think the Puritan approach is right, because the Bible says that self-love is bad. The one time the Bible directly references self-love, it is in one of the letters to Timothy, where in this vision of the end of days when people are very sinful, one of the sins the Bible lists is people will be lovers of themselves. Now, of course, anytime I say this, people are always like, oh, but Jesus said you have to love your neighbor as yourself, so that means you have to love yourself first, right? Well, no. He's not commanding us to love ourselves, he's assuming that we love ourselves, because all of us do love ourselves, because all of us are selfish. And this is rooted in another difference between Catholicism and Protestantism. It's the question of whether concupiscence, or the desire to sin, is sin. So I think we can say we are sinful simply by having an inclination to sin. I think self-love is that inclination to sin, because fundamentally, all of us care more about ourselves than God or our neighbors. And that's why Jesus says to love your neighbor as yourself. Because all of us already love ourselves. Even people who say they hate themselves, even people who have depression, say they hate themselves, actually love themselves. Because somehow they are stuck in a cycle where their self-loathing gives them some sort of pleasure. It is somehow what they think is right for them. As C.S. Lewis said, the antidote to self-love isn't self-hate. It's not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. And that's what will help a lot of people. I think a lot of people these days will be helped by thinking about themselves less. A lot of people think more self-love and more self-care and more self, me will help their mental health problems. What will really help is focusing more outside of yourself, focusing more on God, focusing more on helping other people. That'll help us. So generally, all Christian approaches to mental health are better than the secular approaches, because secular psychology is rooted in this idea that the human soul does not exist. It's really just the brain. And the problem with secular psychology is it treats sin like just any other illness. Like, if someone commits, like, mass murder, Christians will say that person is a sinner, and they need to be judged by God for it. Whereas when a secular person, a secular psychologist, sees a mass murderer, they'll be like, oh, this person must have had some mental illness. The thing is, there is no limit to what you could ascribe to mental illness, and that means no one can ever be held morally responsible for their actions. So, I will say the Catholic approaches to psychology are better than the secular approaches, because they still include some type of moral responsibility. So, like I said, the Catholic approach is still better than the secular approach, but I think only the Puritan approach is sufficiently biblical, where the Puritan approach says any self-love is sin. And if you are trying to pursue, like, mental health for the sake of self-love, that is sin. For the sake of selfishness, that is sin. So I'm not saying, therefore, that no mental health things are real. Of course, if you are a veteran and you have PTSD, that's probably real. And then you probably should get help for that, because it's not going to be good for your family if you always have PTSD. If you're an alcoholic, there is a neurological component to that, so you should get help for that, so you're not a danger to your family and friends. But if you're just, feeling down and feeling anxious and you want to feel better, so you seek help so you can just live a better life for your own sake, that is sin. That's self-love, and that's sin. Generally, if we care about improving ourselves, it should be so we can serve God's kingdom more effectively. Now, yes, you could say that, I want to get help so I can serve God's kingdom more effectively, and that is fair, but the vast majority of the time, people who focus on mental health, like the people who post about mental health on Instagram all the time, are the most selfish people. You know it's true. It mostly targets women. Now, there's a lot of sins that men are inclined to, such as pornography, such as, raging online and simping and LARPing and all this stupid stuff, but generally, women tend to focus more on the sin of self-love. That tends to be a sin that women fall to more. Basically, I have never met anyone who posts a ton about mental health awareness online who is not, first of all, a very unstable person, and second of all, massively selfish and unpleasant to be around. That's just the reality. Generally, the more you focus on your own mental health, the worse it's gonna be, because you're focusing on yourself, and the Bible says not to focus on yourself too much. So I think that's the real underlying difference between the Puritan approach, which independent fundamental Baptists seem to hold to, and the Catholic approach. And I also think that Pentecostals generally have good instincts about this. Like I said, I'm not quite a complete independent fundamental Baptist and Pentecostal who denies all mental health issues, but I think their instinct is in the right place. Their instinct is that if you rely too much on mental health treatment and psychology, then you're not really going to be trusting Jesus for internal transformation. Jesus said that existential anxiety is a sin. Worrying about what you're going to eat, about tomorrow's troubles, that is a sin, and it's a sin I am very, very guilty of. We're all guilty of sin, but it is still a sin. It's still not something that we should tolerate. It's not something we should excuse on the grounds of some mental health type of thing. We shouldn't excuse any of it. So I think that the average common secular mental health is really detrimental to the Christian faith. And I think the independent fundamental Baptist and Pentecostal skepticism of it is justified. Now, I am not an expert on this. I know that there's, some forms of psychological treatment that are good and necessary. I know there are some conditions, like severe autism or PTSD or schizophrenia that do need to be treated somehow, and really, are rooted in neurology. But even so, there are many miraculous stories of people mentally curing what are deemed to be incurable mental illnesses by, prayer or just by personal character development. The brain is a lot more malleable than we think it is. The placebo effect is very powerful. The brain has the ability to rewire itself because the brain is connected to the soul, which has free will. Yes, I'm a Calvinist. I do believe the soul has free will. I'm not one of those radical determinists. That's not what any Calvinists are. It's a complete straw man of our position. So, because of that, because I don't think self-love is good, I don't think a lot of the motivations behind modern mental health is good. So what should we do? What should the Christian approach to mental health be? So we should understand that, basically, every spiritual sickness is sin. Every spiritual sickness is sin. And everything that gets categorized as a mental health problem is either a neurological problem or a spiritual problem. There isn't this, third middle ground category called the mind, between the brain and the soul. It's either neurological or spiritual or a combination of both. So some things like schizophrenia, you could say, yeah, that's neurological. And we know it's neurological because medicine really does help it. But there is no evidence that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance. There's no evidence. They thought it was. That was debunked. There's also no evidence that antidepressants are any more than placebo pills. They proved that in a recent study. And some people will be like, oh, antidepressants helped me. And I'm like, do you know what placebo means? So I think in many cases, of course, I can't pretend to know everything, but in many cases, I think more cases than we want to admit, it really is a spiritual thing. A combination of sin and the influence of the demonic. And now I'm sounding pretty Pentecostal, but I think they're right about this particular issue. So I think the remedy needs to be more spiritually oriented, and it needs to be more personal responsibility oriented. I think that is what we need to focus on. When someone commits a sin, we shouldn't speak as if, oh, this person has some horrible mental illness. When someone commits a sin, we need to say they are personally responsible for it. Even though some mental illnesses can impair people's abilities to do certain things, like severe autism impairs people's language, and some other mental illnesses like dyslexia impairs people's ability to read. But mental illness should never be used as an excuse for sin. Ever. I've had a lot of people act really bad, with really bad character, and blame it on their mental illness. Blame it on, oh, I had a bipolar episode. No. All of us have circumstances in our life that might lead us to sin in some ways. Like for example, if you're like, a teenage boy, and you're in like a strip club or something, you can't say, oh, you can't blame me for having lustful thoughts because I was in this environment. You'd say, no, of course, maybe the environment caused you to be more likely to have those thoughts, but it's still your responsibility. It's still sin, and you're still responsible, and you still need to be judged by God for that, and you would be going to hell for that if it weren't for Jesus dying on the cross for you, right? So, if someone has something like bipolar disorder, or depression, or anxiety, and they commit a sin, and they blame it on that, we should say, no. Maybe whatever you have inclined you to this a little bit more, but fundamentally you are still responsible for every single sin that you commit, because every sin that you commit is a sin that nailed Jesus to the cross. That is the approach we should take. So I don't think we should have a hard denial of everything mental health the way some independent fundamental Baptists might have, supposedly. But what we absolutely should do is we should not let people get away with things on the ground of mental health. We need to increase personal responsibility. That's what we really need. That's what we need. So yeah, that is why I am skeptical of modern mental health rhetoric. It takes sin out of the equation. It takes personal responsibility out of the equation. It causes selfishness to be virtuous. So what I think we need to do is we need to adopt a Puritan mindset. We need to face the harsh, cold truth that self-love is sin, that you are a sinner who deserves to go to hell. Whatever mental health struggle you are facing, you deserve something a lot worse than that. You deserve to be roasting in hell for all eternity. Alright? But luckily, Jesus died for your sins. even though you didn't deserve it one bit. So because of that, you should be eternally grateful for that. You have nothing to be depressed or anxious about. So if you still have internal struggles, pray that you'll accept the reality of the gospel and see the beauty of it and apply it to your everyday life. God bless.